Welcome to the International Online Rally for a mass movement of youth and students to stop the war in Ukraine, hosted by the International Youth and Students for Social Equality. My name is Gregor Link. I'm a member of the IYSSE in Germany. The IYSSE is the youth movement of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the Trotskyist Party of World Socialist Revolution. This rally aims to unite youth and working people across the world against the war in Ukraine, which threatens to escalate into World War III. The interaction between the imperialist militarism of NATO, recklessly pursuing its global geopolitical agenda whatever the consequences, and the increasing desperation of Russia's oligarchic capitalist regime threatens to escalate into a nuclear conflagration. This week's drone attacks on 2 Russian air bases mark another ominous escalation. The US-NATO proxy war in Ukraine must be stopped immediately before it results in a global catastrophe that would end human civilization. The well-known saying that truth is the first casualty of war is being vindicated. Every aspect of this war, as it is justified by the NATO powers and the media they control, is based on lies. There is no examination of the historical origins of the war, let alone the geopolitical and economic interests of the governments that are waging it. The news accounts consist of nothing but propaganda. Our rally will explain how the war in Ukraine was planned and how it was launched. Leading members of the IYSSE internationally will lay bare the roots of the evolving conflict, uncover the social forces responsible for it, and the political and economic motives underlying its ongoing escalation. Speakers from throughout the world will elaborate a unified socialist perspective for youth and workers to fight against war, drawing on the lessons of history and the entire heritage of revolutionary internationalism. The standpoint of this rally is unconditional opposition to all of the governments waging this war. The IYSSE's exposure of the instigation of this war by American imperialism does not lessen our opposition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is being waged by the Putin government not in defense of the Russian working class, but in the interests of the country's oligarchs. We condemn the wanton killing of Ukrainian civilians who are not responsible for the criminal policies of the Kiev government and its NATO sponsors. We reject the Putin regime's appeal to Russian nationalism, which revives a reactionary ideology that was repudiated by the working class when it overthrew capitalism in the Socialist Revolution of October 1917. The IYSSE thus opposes the Russian invasion of Ukraine from the socialist left, not the imperialist right. The aim of this rally is to provide you with the understanding necessary to build a movement against the war, stop the killing, and prevent the escalation of the conflict into a nuclear Third World War. What is at stake is the continued existence of the planet and the future of the young generation. The central theme of this rally is that the war cannot be stopped by appealing to the capitalist ruling classes. NATO does not want peace, it wants war. Having deliberately provoked the conflict through decades of NATO expansion toward Russia's borders and the massive arming of its corrupt satellite regime in Kiev, the imperialist powers are determined to exploit the Kremlin's miscalculated, politically reactionary and disastrous invasion of Ukraine to the hilt. The propaganda that the war is being waged for liberty and human rights, repeated endlessly by a compliant capitalist media, is a pack of lies. The US and NATO do not care one iota for the lives of workers and youth in Ukraine and regard them as mere pawns in their murderous proxy war against the Kremlin. The aims of American imperialism are to dismantle and subjugate Russia, gain unrestricted access to the country's vast supply of strategic resources, and thus obtain decisive control over the Eurasian landmass. After 30 years of US-led wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya and Syria, wars that killed millions and displaced tens of millions, the target of Wall Street and the Pentagon is increasingly turning towards America's strategic rivals. In the eyes of Washington's war planners, the slaughter in Ukraine is merely a prelude to war against China and great power conflict. The European powers are aggressively pursuing their own imperialist agendas. Just as the US and Canada, they have sabotaged all negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, rejected any ceasefire, and are actively escalating the war. Planning to bring Ukraine under EU and NATO influence, they have shown total callousness toward the fate of the Ukrainian people. The German government seized on the war to launch the largest rearmament campaign since Hitler, which was long in the making, and aims to become Europe's largest military power. 80 years after the Nazi war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, German imperialism is again sending tanks into Ukraine against Russia. The German ruling class invaded Ukraine twice in the 20th century and murdered millions of its citizens. In total, the genocidal campaign of the fascist armies of Nazi Germany brought death to 27 million citizens of the Soviet Union and more than 6 million Jewish people. The current war campaign stands in this tradition. The fighting today even occurs in many of the same places. Together with its American, Canadian and British allies, Berlin is arming the political hears to the Nazi Wehrmacht's collaborators in Ukraine, combined with a breathtaking campaign of trivializing the Nazi crimes. The European ruling classes are determined to expand their territories, markets and global influence, intensifying tensions among the NATO powers themselves. From the Baltic Sea to the Eastern Mediterranean, the inter-imperious rivalries that gave rise to 2 world wars are breaking up again, in Europe, but also around the world. In our statement, we called attention to the fact that the capitalist oligarchs have twice in the 20th century made clear that they are willing to sacrifice millions of people in pursuit of their profits. People on broad swaths of the world's surface witnessed barbarism on a scale never before seen in history. We wrote, World War I, which erupted in 1914, resulted in the death of more than 20 million people. Imperialism introduced the world to the horrors of trench warfare and poison gas and the murderous technical innovations of aerial bombardments, submarines armed with torpedoes and tanks. But the horrors of that global conflict proved merely a prelude to the barbarism of World War II, which began in 1939, only 21 years after the end of the First World War. The Second World War witnessed, as a matter of official and deliberate policy, the mass extermination of civilian populations. This included the industrialized genocide of the Holocaust and the firebombing of major cities, and culminated in the dropping of atomic bombs by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The scale of death virtually defied comprehension. A third world war, which is developing rapidly, would be waged with advanced nuclear weapons and would not cost millions, but billions of lives. It would directly escalate every existing conflict and involve all countries on Earth. Megacities like Shanghai, New York, Berlin and Moscow would be wiped out in minutes. In our statement we warned, anyone who believes that the ruling class is not prepared to sacrifice tens of millions of lives in the pursuit of its geopolitical interests need only consider the experience of the past 2.5 years. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the corporate and financial oligarchy rejected the most basic public health measures required to contain the spread of the virus because they impinged on profits. More than 20 million people died as a result. This capitalist policy of mass murder, which fueled the pandemic, is now taken to an almost unimaginable level. Having declared it necessary to live with a virus that is killing millions, the NATO powers and their allies now insist that they will not be intimidated by the prospect of a nuclear war that would kill billions. Leading NATO figures like retired US General Ben Hodges openly declare that the further escalation of the war is set to lead to the total collapse of the Russian Federation, that is, the violent breakup of the country with the world's largest nuclear weapons arsenal. To spell out this danger, however, does not in any way constitute an accommodation to the Putin regime. As I have already stated, we unequivocally oppose the Russian military's intervention, which further escalates the war and has no progressive character whatsoever. The military invasion of the Kremlin benefits the capitalist oligarchy in Russia. A comrade from Russia will speak to this question in more detail. reviewing the lessons of the monumental betrayals of the Second and Third Internationals, which facilitated the imperialist descent into World Wars I and II, the great revolutionary socialist Leon Trotsky concluded in 1934, to enable the peoples to live, the structure of the national state must be raised to its foundations. He went on, a socialist who preaches national defense is a petty bourgeois reactionary at the service of decaying capitalism. Not to bind itself to the national state of time of war, to follow not the war map but the map of the class struggle, is possible only for that party that has already declared irreconcilable war on the national state in time of peace. Only by realizing fully the objectively reactionary role of the imperialist state can the proletarian vanguard become invulnerable to all types of social patriotism. This means that a real break with the ideology and policy of national defense is possible only from the standpoint of the international proletarian revolution. This is the internationalist socialist perspective of the IYSSE and the ICFI that must now be fought for. The Socialist Equality Party in Germany will put this fight at the heart of its upcoming election campaign in Berlin, the world capital of imperialist crime. We base ourselves on the tradition of revolutionary socialist internationalism, that of Luxemburg and Liebknecht, of Lenin and Trotsky. The only force that can stop World War III is the international working class, the broad mass of people on this planet, which is increasingly entering into struggle. Apart from the independent intervention of this most powerful social force, this war will go on and escalate. It will not be ended by the ruling class. They have made their decision. We must bring an end to it because the future of all of humanity is at stake. In our statement we write, 400 years ago, Shakespeare's Hamlet posed the fundamental existential question to be or not to be. In the present-day world, this question is raised not as a matter of philosophical speculation, but rather as the supreme political challenge confronting mankind. In addition to the danger of nuclear war, climate change and future pandemics threaten the lives of hundreds of millions of people in the coming decades. The working class must put an end to capitalism before capitalism puts an end to the world. These are the fundamental questions that our generation faces. The IYSSE calls on youth in all countries to turn to the working class and build this international anti-war movement in all factories, workplaces, schools and universities.
It's terrifying, the fact that Armageddon, as Biden calls it, is a plausible outcome to the escalation of this war in Ukraine. And the science on what a nuclear war would look like, a nuclear winter, is terrifying.
A nuclear war would be extremely bad for every single person in the world. If it wasn't directly, at least indirectly, radiation poisoning. And
if the nuclear war will start, it will destroy whole society.
This could kill everybody on Earth. This could end life as we know it. I don't think they're that afraid to do it. You know, not like the ruling elite were during the Cold War.
With the president in Ukraine, Zelensky, demanding that Russia be nuked.
The same exact ruling class has killed 20 million people through COVID, or rather the lack of measures to combat COVID. History proves that capitalism is fully capable of destroying human life at immense levels. You know, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, it's absolutely insane. And of course they're going to be willing to sacrifice the working class at the altar of profit. They've already done it, you know, in regards to COVID.
This war is not the working class war. This is the ruling class war.
Young people here are being put on the front lines and, you know, for a war that we don't want.
The war in Ukraine has brought the world closer to nuclear annihilation than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Just 2 months ago, US President Joe Biden warned that the war could trigger Armageddon, a full-scale nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia. The conflict in Ukraine has already killed or maimed 200,000 people. But even as the war grows more violent and brutal, as the toll on civilians and soldiers, Ukrainians and Russians grows, the US is relentlessly escalating its involvement in the conflict, disregarding the potentially catastrophic consequences. American imperialism, which has provoked instigated and prolonged this war has deemed Armageddon an acceptable risk, gambling with the very existence of human civilization. Every time the United States has claimed it would not do something in Ukraine, it has then gone ahead and done it. In May, Biden said, quote, "The idea that we're going to send in offensive equipment and have planes and tanks and trains going in with American pilots and American crews, that's called World War III." But the US has not only sent armored vehicles, drones, and long-range missiles to Ukraine, it has trained the crews who operate them and directed their targeting. In November, the Pentagon confirmed that active-duty US military personnel are deployed in Ukraine, traveling throughout the country to oversee the distribution and use of weapons provided by the United States. In an editorial entitled "What America Will and Will Not Do in Ukraine," Biden said that, quote, "We are not encouraging or enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders." But Washington has done precisely that, giving targeting information, weapons, and logistics support that have allowed the Ukrainian military to attack Russian military installations, first in Crimea and then on the Russian mainland. Every statement made by the White House about the war is mired in self-contradiction. US officials tell the public that Russia's unprovoked invasion marks an irrevocable break with the world before 2022. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, Biden declared in March, sparked a battle between a rules-based order and one governed by brute force. What ridiculous hypocrisy! The cheerleaders of American capitalism declared that the dissolution of the USSR in 1991 and the introduction of market reforms in China would bring perpetual peace, the so-called peace dividend, and the end of history. But US imperialism responded to the dissolution of the USSR with a worldwide military bloodbath, seeking to achieve global hegemony by dominating the former colonial world. The United States invaded Iraq in 1991, bombed Yugoslavia in 1999, invaded Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003, destroyed Libya in 2011, and instigated the Syrian civil war that same year. The motto of these wars, as expressed in a 2003 editorial by the Wall Street Journal, was "Force works." Since the start of the Cold War, the United States has invaded, housed troops in, or carried out coups and destabilization operations in the vast majority of the world's countries. The criminality of US imperialism was embodied in the Vietnam War, which killed over 1 million people, and in which US troops engaged in the systematic mass murder of civilians, such as the infamous My Lai massacre, in which as many as 504 unarmed men, women, children, and infants were killed. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, launched on the basis of lies, destroyed an entire society and led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The criminality of the US occupation was exposed in the Abu Ghraib torture photos, which revealed the horrific reality of the US military's systematic use of torture as state policy. The war in Ukraine does not mark the negation of American crimes in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, but their continuation. After all, it was the war criminal George W. Bush, the author of the Iraq War, who welcomed Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Slovenia into NATO in 2004 and declared in 2008 that, quote, "It's in our interest for Ukraine to join NATO." Since then, the United States has worked to make Bush's goal a reality, orchestrating the overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014, then funneling billions of dollars of weapons into Ukraine, training its military to NATO standards, and de facto endorsing the Zelensky government's stated goal of retaking Crimea through military force. The war in Ukraine is the outcome of the systematic effort by the United States to militarily encircle Russia and draw it in to proxy wars on its borders. Putin responded to the provocations of US imperialism by launching a reactionary invasion of Ukraine, doing exactly what the imperialists hoped he would do, and falling into a trap that the US had openly prepared for years. None of this antecedent history is ever referenced in media presentations of the war. The script used after the September 11, 2001 terror attacks has been trotted out once again. Historical analysis, reason, and thought are to be abandoned in responding decisively to an unimaginable atrocity. The actions of the villain of the hour justify any US response. But as with the wars that followed 9/11, cynically prepared with lies and media propaganda, the escalation of the US war with Russia and war plans with China have been years in the making. US military documents, never discussed in public, justify war as a means to advance America's interests in an increasingly competitive global environment in which America's hegemony is threatened by the economic growth of China. War, the Pentagon declares, is essential to defend the interests of American capitalism. The 2020s, the US National Security Strategy document declares, are a decisive decade for America and the world, in which the terms of geopolitical competition between the major powers will be set. We have entered an age of great power conflict, US military strategists declare, a period characterized by, in the words of NATO, high-intensity, multi-domain warfighting against nuclear-armed peer competitors. For years, US military strategists have been rethinking Armageddon, aiming to develop scenarios in which nuclear weapons would actually be used. The world has entered the second nuclear age, they declare, in which the use of nuclear weapons is no longer unthinkable. To fight these wars, the United States is modernizing every single component of its nuclear weapon systems, of which the B-21 bomber, released this month with media fanfare, is just one component. Speaking amid the wreckage of the historic German city of Nuremberg after World War II, Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, in his opening speech to the trial of Nazi leaders, excoriated the greatest menace of our times, aggressive war. Condemning the political leaders, business officials, and generals that plotted Germany's effort to conquer Europe, Jackson denounced the fierce nationalisms and militarisms of intrigue and war-making that have embroiled Europe generation after generation. Jackson declared that civilization can afford no compromise with these social forces. But the experience of the 20th and 21st century shows that the social forces that gave rise to war can only be opposed by the mobilization of opposing social forces. The great Marxists of the 20th century, foremost among which were Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, understood imperialist war to be the expression of the domination over society by predatory finance capital. That is, that war and capitalism are inextricably linked. The war drive of American imperialism is accompanied by a ferocious assault on the social position of workers in the United States and internationally. But the world's workers are responding to the global wave of austerity and social counter-revolution with a global strike wave. It is to this mass movement of the working class that young people must orient and appeal to in their fight for the future. The warmongers at the Pentagon claim that this will be the decisive decade in ensuring the domination of American capitalism at home and abroad. But for workers and young people, this decade will be decisive for another reason. This young decade, the World Socialist website wrote in January of 2020, will be the decade of socialist revolution. The same conditions that produce imperialist war produce the conditions for its abolition through the socialist transformation of society. And the final abolition of war means the final abolition of capitalism. It is to our generation that this momentous task falls. We must all take to heart Albert Einstein's warning. I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. He was right. The survival of human civilization is not guaranteed. And if young people are to have a future, they must fight for it.
Сегодняшнее антивоенное мероприятие происходит в контексте серьезного социально-экономического кризиса мировой капиталистической системы, подчеркивающего приходящий характер капиталистического общества. Кризис является проявлением старых противоречий. Прежде всего, это касается двух фундаментальных противоречий между общественным характером производства и частнокапиталистическим присвоением, между глобализированной экономикой и делением мира на национальные государства. Гармоничное развитие человечества и его производительных сил невозможно в рамках капиталистического способа производства. Своим иррациональным существованием этот способ показывает необходимость его свержения. Нынешний кризис не только является наследником прошлых кризисов XX века, вызвавших 2 мировые войны и другие социальные бедствия, но и несет в себе угрозу новой мировой войны. Главной движущей силой будущей мировой войны является американский империализм, политика которого и спровоцировала буржуазный режим Путина на реакционное вторжение в Украину. Война, начатая вторжением Путина в Украину 24 февраля текущего года, является лишь промежуточным этапом в эскалации мировой войны, которая затронет каждую страну вне зависимости от ее местоположения. Кризис, с которым сталкивается мировой финансовый капитал, прежде всего американский и европейский финансовый капитал, толкает его к новой войне за передел мира, чтобы восстановить капиталистическое равновесие и тем самым сохранить капиталистический строй. Как бы капиталистический режим Путина не пытался играть на чувствах российского народа о Великой Отечественной войне, он не сможет вечно затушевывать очевидные противоречия между классовым характером Советского Союза и Российской Федерации. Советский Союз стал продуктом одного из важнейших событий в истории – Октябрьской революции 1917 года, породившей его как первое рабочее государство. Исторические обстоятельства сложились так, что первой страной, в которой пролетариат смог взять власть, стала отсталая, населенная в основном неграмотными крестьянами Россия. Однако те же причины, что заставили российский пролетариат взять власть раньше пролетариата передовых стран, поспособствовали национальной реакции сталинской бюрократии на интернациональную программу «Октября», за которую боролись Ленин, Троцкий и большевики. Это привело к вырождению Советского Союза и появлению привилегированного слоя бюрократии, враждебного международным интересам Октябрьской революции. Противоречивое и переходное положение Советского Союза выражалось в формуле Льва Троцкого: либо бюрократ съест рабочее государство, либо рабочий свергнет бюрократа. Дальнейшее развитие Советского Союза подтвердило эту формулу Троцкого в негативном ключе. К середине 1980-х годов бюрократия решилась на перестройку и открыла дорогу реставрации капитализма в Советском Союзе. Россия и Украина стали одними из ее 15 продуктов. Новоиспеченная российская буржуазия поверила, что будет способна интегрироваться в мировую финансовую систему, сохраняя при этом доброжелательные отношения с империалистическими хищниками. Эта наивность была разрушена политикой западного империализма, движущегося к эскалации войны из-за внутреннего кризиса, являющегося проявлением фундаментального международного кризиса капитализма. Путинский режим не имеет никаких средств, чтобы остановить эту эскалацию. Его волнует только сохранение привилегированного положения российской буржуазии в богатой на сырьевые ресурсы стране. Все его мечты о многополярном мире являются утопическими мечтами класса, находящегося в хвосте истории. Российская буржуазия слишком поздно поднялась на сцену умирающего капитализма. Что касается украинской олигархии, то ее демагогическая риторика о борьбе за демократию, европейский путь развития, является подлым обманом трудящихся масс. Политика украинского капитала, находящегося под сапогом западного империализма, не способна к тому, чтобы разрешить все важнейшие проблемы украинского общества. Украинские массы столкнулись с очень тяжелым историческим бременем. Они находятся в ловушке между двух огней – западного империализма и путинского национал-шовинизма. Искренне сочувствуя нынешнему положению украинских и российских трудящихся масс, мы призываем их к переосмыслению событий, происходящих на их территории. Понимание социально-экономических и исторических причин нынешней ситуации поможет российскому и украинскому рабочему классу осознать всю важность борьбы за интернационализм, преодолевая все национальные, религиозные и этнические преграды. Именно ложная политика Сталина и его последователей, противоположная изначальной ленинской национальной политике, сделала из Советского Союза пороховую бочку межнациональных конфликтов, которые сразу же раскрылись по мере реставрации капитализма в СССР. Братоубийственная война между Россией и Украиной является одним из тягчайших последствий этой ложной политики, за которую расплачиваются рабочие классы Украины и России не только ухудшением своего положения, но и самой жизнью. Но несмотря на конфликты между собой, буржуазия всего мира объединена в одном принципиальном вопросе – ни в коем случае не допустить мировой социалистической революции. Она, буржуазия, скорее потопит мир в реках крови, чем даст возможность для ликвидации капитализма и построения нового общественного строя, способного вести человечество вперед без бессмысленных человеческих жертв. что в России, что в Украине правящие режимы навязывают и распространяют национал-шовинистическую риторику, пытаясь стабилизировать собственные режимы посредством национального единства, что выражается в росте ультраправых тенденций – Азов в Украине, ЧВК «Вагнер» в России. Но есть одно «но». Международный рабочий класс занимает особое место в мировой экономике. Именно на нем держатся все международные экономические связи и происходит производство всего богатства человеческого общества. Положение рабочего класса дает ему всемирно-историческое значение потому, чтобы разрешить противоречия капитализма, обладающие международным характером. Интернационализм рабочего класса способен помочь человечеству гармоничным образом преодолеть все националистические конфликты, включая развязанный империализмом конфликт между Украиной и Россией. Однако, одних объективных факторов недостаточно для преодоления кризиса. Есть еще и субъективный фактор. Рабочему классу нужна собственная организация, партия, которая будет способна защищать и продвигать его интересы в международном масштабе. В этом отношении очень актуальна борьба Ленина и Троцкого за Третий интернационал против предательства социал-демократии, а затем борьба Троцкого за Четвертый интернационал против переродившегося из-за сталинской реакции Третьего интернационала. Что Троцкий, что Ленин всегда боролись за построение независимой пролетарской организации, причем объединенной на международном уровне. Они очень остро видели и понимали вопрос о революционном руководстве. Не зря именно большевикам удалось совершить Октябрьскую революцию, показав важность революционного руководства в дни, когда революция может решиться на целые годы вперед. Кризисы 20 века не были преодолены, так как мировая революция в силу целого ряда факторов не смогла осуществиться. Что не смогла сделать революция, то попыталась сделать контрреволюция в лице буржуазии и реформистских и сталинистских партий. Им удалось восстановить некоторое равновесие после Второй мировой войны, но оно было временным и только подняло проблемные вопросы на новый уровень, нисколько не решив ни одного из них. Реальность опрокинула реформистов всех оттенков. Все старые рабочие организации показали свой контрреволюционный характер. Большая часть рабочих и молодежи не просто игнорируют эти организации, они их ненавидят. Вовлеченность широких масс рабочих и молодежи в политику возможна только на основе отбрасывания всех старых реакционных организаций. Широким массам нужна новая революционная организация, основанная на приверженности большевистским принципам 1917 года. Мы называем себя большевиками-ленинцами не просто так. Этим мы подчеркиваем нашу историческую и принципиальную связь с борьбой левой оппозиции против сталинизма за сохранение традиций большевизма. Большевики-ленинцы были реальной социалистической альтернативой реакционному сталинскому курсу развития социализма в одной стране. Они вели свою борьбу против пересмотра марксизма термидорианской сталинской бюрократией, деятельность которой позже привела к реставрации капитализма в СССР. В будущем именно из международных рядов большевиков-ленинцев будет сформирован Четвертый интернационал. Молодая гвардия большевиков-ленинцев ставит перед собой серьезную историческую задачу – построение секции Международного комитета Четвертого интернационала как независимой от троцкистской партии на постсоветском пространстве. Появление нашей организации и образование связи с Международным комитетом является очень важным событием, показывающим возрождение большевистских принципов интернационализма на территории бывшего Советского Союза. Международный комитет Четвертого интернационала не просто призывает к массовому движению молодежи против войны, он стремится его возглавить во всемирном масштабе и тесно связать с борьбой рабочего класса как единственным способом преодоления кризиса капитализма. Борьба против войны означает ныне борьбу за Четвертый интернационал.
My name is Tom Scripps. I am the Assistant National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in the UK. Wars force into the open the real class interests that political tendencies represent. With the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, social democratic parties around the world organized in the Second International lined up behind their own national war efforts. The vote of the German Social Democratic Party, the largest in the world, for war credits, was an epochal betrayal of the socialist movement. only a small group of revolutionary internationalists, led by Vladimir Lenin, stood against the tide and fought for a united struggle of the international working class against their national ruling classes. Under German socialist Karl Liebknecht's immortal phrase, "The main enemy is at home." It was this political fight which prepared the Russian Revolution of 1917, whose seismic impact brought an end to the bloody slaughter. In 1914, Lenin wrote The War on Russian Social Democracy, denouncing the French Social Democrats who claimed to be waging a defensive war against German aggression, and the German Social Democrats who claimed to be fighting Russian despotism. He explained, "It is primarily on social democracy that the duty rests of revealing the true meaning of the war and of ruthlessly exposing the falsehood, sophistry, and patriotic phrasemongering spread by the ruling classes, the landowners and the bourgeoisie, in defense of the war." What is the true meaning of the war in Ukraine, which has been buried under a mountain of lies? In 2014, American and European imperialism helped to bring to power an anti-Russian regime in Ukraine, resting on armed groups of fascists. The geopolitical strategists and military planners in Washington intended to use Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, threatening its geostrategically vital access to the Black Sea. Vast resources were poured into Ukraine's military. Support was given to its ambitions against Russia in Crimea, and discussions were held on NATO membership. With the war now underway, these shipments have massively increased, while NATO has expanded further eastward in Scandinavia. The United States is taking vast strides in its pursuit of global hegemony through the subjugation of Russia and ultimately China. None of this is changed by the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. Yet this is what the myriad pseudo-left tendencies equating Russia and the NATO imperialist powers would have workers and young people believe. Resting on the facile argument that Russia fired the first shot, these organizations echo NATO's propaganda with denunciations of Russian imperialism, identifying the Kremlin rather than Washington as the state with designs on Eastern Europe and Eurasia. The characterization of Russia and of China as imperialist serves to legitimize a policy of breaking these countries up into a series of puppet regimes, with their vast oil, gas, and mineral resources to be controlled by the US and NATO imperialist powers. That is why these tendencies never place the war in the context of the 3 decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, in which the US has waged an uninterrupted series of wars to open up the entire world to its predatory ambitions. Were it simply a matter of denouncing the Russian invasion, then, as we explain in our statement, there are ample grounds to do so without capitulating to the reactionary and deceitful narrative concocted by NATO and the Western corporate media. But in the name of supporting Ukraine's supposed war for self-determination against Russian imperialism, the pseudo-left groups lend support to the US and European powers' proxy war against Russia, waged by far-right Ukrainian forces. Lenin and his co-leader of the Russian Revolution, Leon Trotsky, wrote scathingly of those who argued this way during the First and Second World Wars. In a 1915 resolution on World War I, Lenin wrote, "The question of which group dealt the first military blow or first declared war is immaterial in any determination of the tactics of socialists. Both sides' phrases on the defense of the fatherland, resistance to enemy invasion, a war of defense, etc., are nothing but deception of the people. In War and the Fourth International, written in 1934, Trotsky denounced as a delusion the concept of national defense, especially when it coincides with the idea of the defense of democracy. He explained, "The character of war is determined not by the initial episode taken by itself, violation of neutrality, enemy invasion, etc., but by the main moving forces of war, by its whole development and by the consequences to which it finally leads." Lenin's great insight was to connect the social chauvinist betrayal of the Second International to its socio-economic origins, the pressure on the revolutionary vanguard of a privileged strata of the petty bourgeoisie, including a labour aristocracy, grown accustomed to the standard of life afforded by the plundered wealth of their national state. Today, the pseudo-left's response to the war in Ukraine expresses even more directly the interests of the affluent middle class, a social layer which has travelled far to the right in recent decades. They are viciously hostile to socialism, hooked on rising stock markets which depend on the suppression of the class struggle, and increasingly aligned with the capitalist state. This is the yawning class divide separating the Trotskyists of the ICFI and the IYSSE from every other political tendency, which all act to tie the working class to this reactionary milieu. In the UK, this found consummate expression in recent years in the support of every pseudo-left tendency for Jeremy Corbyn, whose leadership of the Labour Party was meant to mark a socialist revival. Instead, Corbyn and his supporters surrendered to the right wing on every question of principle, above all in their abandonment of opposition to NATO and the Trident nuclear weapons system. The Labour Party is now firmly in the hands of the warmonger Sir Keir Starmer, who declares its unshakable support for NATO. Corbyn is no longer permitted even to sit as one of its MPs. Today's rump of 11 Corbynite MPs have prostrated themselves before Starmer's warmongering, withdrawing their support from a Stop the War Coalition open letter criticising NATO within an hour of him telling them to do so. In 2003, prior to the Iraq War, the Stop the War Coalition led a protest of more than 1 million people. Today, having crumbled under the first salvo from the Labour Party and the bourgeois press, it barely functions. Corbyn himself makes an occasional personal call for a negotiated end to the war, while reassuring the CIA's own Radio Free Europe that Labour under his leadership would still be supporting Ukraine's right to defend itself, and declaring that he did not blame NATO for the fact Russia has invaded Ukraine. The International Committee of the Fourth International bases its response to the NATO-Russia conflict on the understanding that the same conditions which give rise to war give rise to social revolution, bringing the international working class onto the field of battle. In its 2016 statement, Socialism and the Fight Against War, the ICFI set out the principles on which a new socialist mass anti-war movement would have to be built. Above all, we insisted the struggle against war must be based on the working class, the great revolutionary force in society, uniting behind it all progressive elements in the population. Right now in the UK, hundreds of thousands of workers are engaged in national strike action on a scale not seen for generations. Millions have balloted for action. This is part of an international upsurge of the class struggle, driven by a collapse in living standards intimately connected to the imperialist war. The International Youth and Students for Social Equality is determined to politically prepare the developing struggle of the working class against the imperialist warmongers. Make the decision today to join this fight for genuine socialism.
Merhaba, ben Harun Akın. Toplumsal Eşitlik için Uluslararası Gençlik ve Öğrencilerin üyesiyim. Bugün sizlere Ukrayna'nın sadece birkaç yüz kilometre güneybatısındaki İstanbul'dan sesleniyorum. Türkiye'de nüfusun çoğunluğu Ukrayna'daki savaşa karşı. Balkanlardan Orta Doğu'ya ve Kafkasya'ya kadar uzanan bölgede onlarca yıldır kesintisiz süren savaş ve katliamlara tanıklık eden işçiler daha fazla gereksiz acı ve ölüme karşı çıkıyor. NATO üyesi diğer ülkelerde olduğu gibi Türkiye'deki işçi ve gençlik kitleleri de hayat pahalılığı, artan sömürü ve yoksulluk ile geleceksizlik sorunlarıyla karşı karşıya bulunuyor. 15-24 yaş arası her 3 gençten biri işsiz. Bir araştırmaya göre aynı yaş grubundaki gençlerin 3'te 2'si ülkenin geleceğini iyi görmüyor. Gençler savaş değil, düzgün bir iş, güvenli ve umutlu bir gelecek istiyor. Ancak bunun için savaşa ve onun kaynağı olan kapitalist sisteme karşı bilinçli bir mücadele gerekiyor. Rusya ve Çin toprakları başta olmak üzere Avrasya'daki emperyalist çıkarlarını ilerletmek için Ukrayna halkını bir top yemi olarak kullanan NATO güçleri bu savaşın Ukrayna halkının kendi kaderini tayin hakkı ile ilgili olduğunu öne sürüyor. Gerçekte ise Rus işçi sınıfı ile köklü kardeşlik bağları bulunan Ukraynalı emekçi kitleler NATO'ya katılma ve ABD'ye tabi bir devlet olma uğruna böyle bir felaketle karşılaşmayı istemediler. Bunu isteyen ABD önderliğindeki emperyalist güçler ve Ukrayna oligarşisiydi. Dahası bizzat Ukrayna ve eklemek gerekir ki Türkiye'de dahil olmak üzere bölgede kendi ulusal azınlıklarına baskı uygulamayan ve temel demokratik hakları hiçe saymayan tek bir ülke yoktur. Emperyalist ve kapitalist güçlerin ulusal azınlıkların demokratik hakları konusundaki ikiyüzlülüğünün ve sahtekarlığın en açık örneklerinden biri 10 yıllardır Siyonist İsrail rejiminin aralıksız baskısına maruz kalan Filistin halkının içinde bulunduğu durumdur. Bizler kendi hükümetlerinin suçlarından sorumlu olmayan Ukraynalı kitlelerle dayanışma içindeyiz. Ancak Filistinlilerin ya da diğer ezilen halkların durumuna gözlerimizi kapatmıyoruz. Balkanlardan Karadeniz'e, Kafkasya'ya ve Akdeniz'e kadar milyonlarca işçi ve gencin müttefikleri ve dostları kim? Jeopolitik hedefleri uğruna 100 yılı aşkın bir süredir bütün bu bölgeyi yakıp yıkan, bugün tüm dünyayı bir nükleer çatışmayla tehdit eden ABD ve Avrupa emperyalizmi mi? Yoksa bu emperyalist sisteme tabi olan ve kendi sınıflarının çıkarlarını gözeten Türkiye, Rusya, Mısır ya da Suudi Arabistan'daki gerici kapitalist rejimler mi? Elbette hayır. Tüm bu rejimler işçi sınıfının ve gençliğin amansız düşmanlarıdır. Rusya dışındaki güçler ABD emperyalizminin 1. Körfez Savaşı'ndan beri bölgeyi mahvetmesinin suç ortaklığını yapmıştır. Yugoslavya'dan Irak'a, Suriye'ye, Libya'ya ve Yemen'e kadar 30 yıldır devam eden emperyalist müdahaleler ve rejim değişikliği savaşları milyonlarca insanın ölümüne, on milyonlarca insanın da yerinden yurdundan edilmesine neden olmuştur. İkinci Dünya Savaşı'ndan bu yana en büyük sığınmacı krizinin kurbanı olan emekçiler ve gençler, kendilerini felakete sürükleyen aynı egemen seçkinler tarafından günah keçisi ilan ediliyorlar. Daha iyi bir gelecek umuduyla Avrupa'ya doğru yola koyulduklarında ise ya Akdeniz'de ve Ege'de ölüme gönderiliyor ya da Kuzey Afrika'da ve Yunanistan'da toplama kamplarına kapatılıyorlar. Toplumsal eşitlik için uluslararası gençlik ve öğrenciler, göçmenler de dahil olmak üzere tüm işçileri ortak bir devrimci mücadelede birleştirmeye çalışıyor. Bu mücadelede herkes için yurttaşlık hakkı da dahil eşit hakları savunuyoruz. Ukrayna'daki savaş daha önce eşi görülmemiş bir kriz yaratarak pek çok ülkeyi çatışma girdabının içine çekiyor. Karadeniz, Akdeniz ve Kafkasya'da çeşitli devletler arasındaki rekabet ve sınır anlaşmazlıkları küresel bir boyut kazanma tehdidi içeren bölgesel savaş riskleri yaratıyor. Kafkasya'da Sovyetlerin dağıtılmasının acı sonuçlarından biri olan Ermenistan-Azerbaycan çatışması tekrar alevleniyor. Doğu Akdeniz'de ise Ukrayna'daki savaş ve bölgedeki hidrokarbon kaynaklarını kontrol etme mücadelesiyle şiddetlenen köklü tarihsel çatışmalar, NATO müttefikleri Türkiye ile Yunanistan'ı doğrudan silahlı bir çatışmaya doğru sürüklüyor. NATO'nun Rusya ile Vekil Savaşı'nda önemli bir ikmal üssü haline gelen Yunanistan askeri olarak güçlendiriliyor. Hem Rusya hem de Ukrayna ile olan güçlü ekonomik ve siyasi bağlarından dolayı savaşta arabuluculuk rolü oynayan Türkiye ise Atina'nın güçlendirilmesini kendisine yönelik bir tehdit olarak görüyor. Her ikisi de derinleşen bir ekonomik, toplumsal ve siyasi krizle karşı karşıya bulunan Türk ve Yunan hükümetleri kendi egemen sınıflarının gerici jeopolitik çıkarlarını savunmak ve içeride işçi sınıfını bastırmak için savaşa başvurabilir. Bu ciddi tehlike ancak Türkiye ve Yunanistan'daki işlerin birleşik devrimci müdahalesiyle durdurulabilir. Vurgulamak gerekir ki Cumhurbaşkanı Erdoğan hükümetinin Ukrayna'da arabuluculuk girişiminin barışseverlik ile ya da NATO'ya ve savaşa gerçek bir muhalefetle hiçbir ilgisi bulunmamaktadır. Bu tavrın arkasında esas olarak NATO'nun Rusya'ya karşı savaşının feci sonuçlarının Türk burjuvasine yarardan çok zarar getireceği düşüncesi yatmaktadır. Buna karşılık hem Erdoğan hükümeti hem de çeşitli sahte sol güçler tarafından desteklenen burjuva muhalefet sadece Ege Denizi'nde Yunan adalarını işgal ederek savaş çıkarma tehditinde bulunmakta kalmıyor. Aynı zamanda Suriye ve Irak'ta başta Kürtler olmak üzere geniş kitleler için feci sonuçları olacak yeni bir kare harekatına hazırlanıyorlar. Suriye'de Kürt milliyetçisi güçlerin, Türk Silahlı Kuvvetleri'nin, Suriye ordusunun yanı sıra Amerika Birleşik Devletleri, Rusya ve İran birliklerinin bulunması bölgesel bir çatışmanın hızla küresel bir yangını ateşleyebileceği tehlikesine işaret etmektedir. Türk burjuvasının bir asırdır çözmekten aciz olduğunu kanıtladığı temel bir sorun olan Kürt sorunu, Orta Doğu'daki 30 yıllık emperyalist savaşla birlikte hiç olmadığı kadar uluslararası ve patlayıcı bir karakter edinmiş durumda. Bizler, Türk egemen seçkinlerinin gerici savaş politikalarına ve her türlü ulusal baskı ilkesi olarak karşı çıkarken emperyalizmin vekil gücü haline gelen Kürt milliyetçisi hareketlere hiçbir siyasi destek verilemeyeceğini altını çiziyoruz. Hem Türk hem Kürt burjuvası emperyalist güçlerin suç ortağıdır ve kitlelerin demokratik özlemlerine düşmandır. Tüm bölge halklarının özlemi olan toplumsal eşitliğe dayalı barışçıl ve demokratik bir toplum, işçilerin, gençlerin ve ezilen kitlelerin emperyalist savaşa ve bütün kapitalist güçlere karşı uluslararası devrimci birliğini gerektirmektedir. Balkanlar, Orta Doğu ve eski Sovyet Cumhuriyetlerindeki çatışmaların tek ilerici çözümü, işçi sınıfının bütün sınırları kaldıracak sosyalist bir federasyon hedefiyle kitlesel seferberliğinden geçmektedir. Toplumsal eşitlik için uluslararası gençlik ve öğrenciler bu perspektifle aynı fikirde olan bölgedeki tüm gençleri ve işçileri savaşa karşı ve sosyalist bir gelecek uğruna mücadelede bize katılmaya çağırmaktadır. Teşekkür ederim.
I'm Will Lehman. I work at Mack Trucks in Macungie, Pennsylvania, and this year I ran for international president of the United Auto Workers Union. I support the building of a mass movement to stop the Ukraine war. The unending and expanding wars of the United States abroad are inseparable from the escalating war on the working class at home. Only 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Congress, with the support of both the Democrats and Republicans, passed the law prohibiting 100,000 railroad workers from striking, forcing them to accept a contract that they had rejected. The rail workers want to fight for what workers throughout the world demand: a decent standard of living, wages that keep pace with soaring inflation, and work schedules that allow them to spend time with their families. The U.S. always justifies its wars abroad by claiming that it is defending freedom and democracy. But the moment that workers here take any action in defense of our interests, the ruling class doesn't hesitate to utilize the power of the state to suppress us. If railroad workers were to defy this attempt to ram this contract down their throats, there is no doubt that the corporations and the rich would mobilize the army to enforce their dictates. The American working class is beginning to understand this, a process that has the most profound consequences for the fight against war. I ran for president of the United Auto Workers this year on a platform of abolishing the pro-corporate and nationalist union bureaucracy and transferring power to workers on the shop floor. I made clear that I was advancing a program for the international unity of the working class, stressing that workers in every country have the same interests. I explained that I am a socialist, opposed to capitalist exploitation wherever it exists. I spoke out against the wars of the American ruling class, explaining to my coworkers that these wars are waged on behalf of the rich and that we have no interest in fighting them. And many, many workers agreed. Despite the suppression of votes by the UAW apparatus, thousands of workers voted for this program. In my discussions with workers, I encountered enormous support for uniting workers in every country in a common struggle against our class enemies. During my campaign, I spoke with workers in Germany, Sri Lanka, India, and Mexico, and I found that we all want to fight for the same things. Workers throughout the world should draw enormous encouragement from the growth of the class struggle in the United States. The American ruling class wages continuous war abroad, but its most dangerous enemy is here at home. The image of the United States seen by workers in other countries is constantly distorted by the propaganda of the American ruling class. The United States is supposedly the wealthiest country in the world, the land of the American dream. But in fact, the vast wealth of the country is controlled almost exclusively by a tiny corporate and financial elite. And workers in far too many countries have had bombs dropped on their homes and their governments overthrown by the American imperialist war machine. Having only experienced these brutal acts of violence, millions of workers internationally think this is all that exists in the United States. But there are two Americas, the America of the ruling class and the America of the working class. The majority of the American population does not support war, which is carried out behind our backs. The crimes of U.S. imperialism are covered up, and those who expose them, like WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, are imprisoned and tortured. Like workers throughout the world, American workers want to be able to live decent lives, free from poverty and want. The rail workers are part of a growing movement that includes 50,000 academic workers who are currently on strike, dock workers who are laboring under expired contracts, teachers facing the decimation of public education, healthcare workers confronting the collapse of the health system under the impact of the pandemic, young service workers who do not make enough to survive, let alone start a family. After decades of social counter-revolution, American workers are beginning to see through the propaganda from both parties that attempts to divide us against each other and that seeks to pit us against our class coworkers throughout the world. It is this social force that must be mobilized in opposition to imperialist war. There will be no significant anti-war movement that is not led by the working class. That is the essential lesson of the history of the struggle against war. It is on the basis of the class struggle that the international working class will unite against all the evils and consequences of capitalism, from climate change and environmental degradation to inequality and exploitation to the growth of fascism and dictatorship. In the fight against war, our banner must be inscribed with the words of Marx and Engels 170 years ago. Workers of the world unite. We have nothing to lose but our chains.
Capitalism is literally killing us, mentally and physically. We see this, fear of, I guess, just the future.
There's a duty that needs to be done for the future generations, for our children and their children. It's us joining together, unifying, that's going to allow us to actually own everything that's beautiful and true in this world. All the science and art can actually be ours, and ours for us. We're the ones that create this beautiful world, and we should be the ones that prosper within it and not suffer in it.
Capitalism has shown itself to have completely outrun itself pretty much, because the nature of trade and communication these days is completely international, and they are desperately trying to hold on to the outdated idea of a nation state. And to organize the working class against war, we need an international perspective based on socialist principles.
We can't change this system only within this country, because we are depending from outside of this country. All the bottom level has to be united. Then the big changes will proceed.
In economical ways or in social ways, the whole world is really connected. And if we really want to make a big change, and a change enough to turn the tides, I think just one or two places aren't really enough. We really need an international movement. We need people from all over the world to collaborate.
Returning to the working class, they're the only force capable of actually stopping this.
Anyone in the working class of Ukraine, of Russia, of China, I'm proudly standing alongside you.
the fight to oppose war, to abolish war, to bring it to an end is tied with a fight for socialism, with abolishing capitalism itself, because that is the cause of all these wars that happen time and time again in an endless cycle. Workers and youth are facing the same situation in every country.
Realmente la pandemia expresó lo que el capitalismo hace no solamente con un país, sino con la clase trabajadora en general, tanto de los Estados Unidos como de Europa, en China, en todos los países del mundo.
Pandemic or inflations or even climate change, there is not any national answer to that. I don't believe that there is a national solution to this problem. And all of my friends and I are thinking that we really must build an anti-war movement.
We need an anti-war movement because the future is under threat. The little kids I see at school, at work, their right to a future is under threat, and those are the kids that would be used as cannon fodder in a World War III.
The international working class transcends all boundaries of race, identity, religion, sexuality, everything.
We're on the same side. We all have the same problems, and we all have the same enemy in the ruling class that is oppressing all of us.
You know, that nothing can be done. Revolution's not possible. Capitalism can't be overthrown. You know, that's simply not true. You know, history's shown us that it absolutely is possible. Revolution is possible. The same conditions that bring together war bring together revolution. So now is the time for it.
සහෝදර සහෝදරීනි මම සමාජ සමානතාවය සඳහා ජාත්‍යන්තර තරුණයෝ සහ ශිෂ්‍යයෝ සංවිධානයේ ලංකාවේ කැඳවුම්කරු කපිල ප්‍රනාන්දු COVID-19 වසංගතය සහ ඇමරිකා එක්සත් ජනපදය ප්‍රමුඛ නේටෝ බලයන් විසින් යුක්‍රේනය තුළ රුසියාවට එරෙහිව දියත් කරමින් පවතින යුද්ධය හේතුවෙන් කම්කරුවන් මුහුණ දෙන ව්‍යසනකාරී තත්ත්වය විශේෂයෙන් ශ්‍රී ලංකාව ඉන්දියාව සහ සමස්තයක් ලෙස ආසියාව පුරා උග්‍ර මුහුණුවරක් ගෙන තිබෙනවා. ආණ්ඩුව විසින් දරුණු කප්පාදු පිළිවෙත් ක්‍රියාවට නගමින් ආර්ථික අර්බුදයේ මුළු බරම මහජනයා මත පටවන තත්ත්වයේදී ආසියානු කලාපයේ කම්කරු පන්තිය ග්‍රාමීය දුගීන් සහ තරුණයන් පෙර නොවූ මට්ටමේ දරිද්‍රතාවයක් හා විරකියාවක් අත්විඳිමින් සිටිනවා. මේ වසර තුල ආහාර මිල 100%කටත් වඩා ඉහළ යාමක් වාර්තා කරමින් ලෝකයේ ඉහළම උද්දමනය සහ දරිද්‍රතාවය පවතින රටවල් අතරට ශ්‍රී ලංකාව සහ ඇෆ්ගනිස්තානය පැමිණුණා. නවතම ලෝක බැංකු වාර්තාවලට අනුව දකුණු ආසියාවේ වයස අවුරුදු 15ත් 24ත් අතර තරුණ තරුණියන් අතර විරැකියාව 24.1%ක්. ඉන්දියාවේ එය 28.3%ක ඉහළ අගයක් ගන්නා අතර ලංකාවේ එම අගය 26%කට වඩා වැඩි. දකුණු ආසියාවේ වයස අවුරුදු 10ට අඩු දරුවන් අතර සරල පාඩයක් කියවා තේරුම් ගැනීමට නොහැකි ළමුන්ගේ ප්‍රතිශතය වසංගතයට පෙර තිබුණේ 60%ක මට්ටමේ. දැන් ඒ 78%ක් දක්වා වැඩි වෙලා තියෙනවා. දකුණු ආසියාවේ සහ ආසියා පැසිෆික් කලාපයේ කම්කරුවන්ද න්‍යෂ්ටික සමූල ඝාතනයක් මගින් සමස්ත ලෝකයටම තර්ජනය කරන අධිරාජ්‍යවාදී යුද්ධයේ සුළි කුණාටුවට ඇද යමින් තිබෙනවා. යුක්‍රේනය තුල රුසියාවට එරෙහි යුද්ධය තීව්‍ර කරන අතරම ඇමරිකාව එහි නේටෝ සහචරයින්ගේ සහයෝගීතාව සහිතව චීනයට එරෙහි සිය යුද සූදානම වැඩි කරමින් තිබෙනවා. ආසියා පැසිෆික් කලාපයේ එක්සත් ජනපදයේ ප්‍රධාන සහචරයින් වන ජපානය, ඕස්ට්‍රේලියාව සහ ඉන්දියාව චීනය ඉලක්ක කරගන්නා කොඩ්නම් අර්ධ මිලිටරි සන්ධානයට සහභාගී වෙමින් චීනයට එරෙහි යුද ධාවනය සමග මුළුමනින්ම පෙළ ගැසිලා ඉන්නේ. එක්සත් ජනපදය සහ ඉන්දියාව අතර 1992 සිට සිදු කෙරෙන ද්විපාර්ශ්වික යුද අභ්‍යාසයක් වන මලබාර් අභ්‍යාසය මේ වසරේ නොවැම්බර් 8 වෙනිදා සිට 15 වෙනිදා පැවැත්වුණේ ප්‍රකෝපකාරී ලෙස නැගෙනහිර චීන මුහුදේදී. ඊට ඕස්ට්‍රේලියාව සහ ජපානයත් සම්බන්ධ වුණා. ෆැසිස්ට් අගමැති නරේන්ද්‍ර මෝඩිගේ ආණ්ඩුව යටතේ ඉන්දියාව චීනයට එරෙහි එක්සත් ජනපද යුද ධාවනයේ ප්‍රමුඛ රාජ්‍යයක් බවට පරිවර්තනය කරමින් තිබෙනවා. මලබාර් අභ්‍යාසය සඳහා සහභාගී වීමෙන් පසුව ඒ එක්කම ඉන්දියාව නොවැම්බර් 15 වෙනිදා සිට දෙසැම්බර් 1 වෙනිදා දක්වා ඇමරිකාව සමග යුද්ධ අභ්‍යාස ලෙසින් හැඳින්වෙන ඔවුන්ගේ වාර්ෂික හමුදා අභ්‍යාසයක් පැවැත්වුවා. එම යුද්ධ අභ්‍යාසය පැවැත්වුණේ 2020 මැයි මාසයේ පටන් දෙරටේ මිලිටරි බටයන් මුහුණට මුහුණලා සිටින ඉන්දියාව සහ චීන දේශ සීමාවේ සිට කිලෝමීටර් 100ක් දුරින් පිහිටි ඉහළ උත්තාංශ ප්‍රදේශයකයි. චීනයේ ආනයන හා අපනයන සඳහා තීරණාත්මක වන එහි ප්‍රධාන මුහුදු මාර්ග සහිත ඉන්දියන් සාගරය වඩාත් වොෂින්ටනය සහ බීජිනය අතර යුද පිටියක් බවටයි පත්වමින් තිබෙන්නේ. දකුණු ආසියාවේ ඊනියා නිදහසෙන් දශක 7කට වැඩි කාලයක සමස්ත අත්දැකීම බලගතු ලෙස සනාථ කරන්නේ 1917 ඔක්තෝබර් රුසියානු විප්ලවයේ ලෙනින් සමග සමනායකයා වූ ලියෝන් ට්‍රොස්කි විසින් වර්ධනය කරන ලද නොනැතින විප්ලව න්‍යායයේ ඉදිරි දර්ශනයයි. ට්‍රොස්කි පැහැදිලි කළේ ධනේශ්වර වර්ධනය කල්පමා වූ රාජ්‍යවල ජාතික ධනේශ්වරයට මහජනතාවගේ මූලික සමාජ හා ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍ර අයිතීන් සුරක්ෂිත කිරීමට මුළුමනින්ම අසමත් බවයි. බලය තමන් අතට ගනිමින් සමාජවාදී විප්ලවය හරහා මහජනතාවගේ සමාජ හා ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍ර අයිතීන් සහතික කිරීම කළ හැක්කේ අනෙකුත් පීඩිත ජනතාව විශේෂයෙන්ම දුගී ගොවි ජනතාව තමන් පිටුපස පෙළගස්වා ගන්නා කම්කරු පන්තියට පමණයි. 1940 ගණන්වල අගභාගයේ වන තුරුම ආසියානු මහද්වීපයේ වැඩි කොටසක් පැවතුනේ සියවස් ගණනාවක විජිත පාලනය යටතේ. ධනවාදයේ සහ අධිරාජ්‍යවාදයේ රාමුව තුල යටත් විජිත පාලනයෙන් ලද ඊනියා නිදහස මෙම රටවල බිලියන සංඛ්‍යාත කම්කරුවන්ට තරුණයන්ට හා ග්‍රාමීය පීඩිතයන්ට ගෙනලා තියෙන්නේ කුමක්ද? දරිද්‍රතාවය, විරැකියාව, වර්ගවාදී බෙදීම් ඇවිස්සීම හරහා සිවිල් යුද්ධ, ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී අයිතීන් මර්ධනය කිරීම සහ දැන් න්‍යෂ්ටික යුද්ධයේ වැඩෙන අන්තරාය හැර කිසිවක් ඔවුන් ලබා දී නැහැ. නමුත් කම්කරු පන්තිය යලි සටන් කිරීමට පටන්ගෙන තිබෙනවා. ගත වූ වසර පුරා ජනාධිපති ගෝඨාභය රාජපක්ෂගේ හිටපු ආණ්ඩුවට එරෙහිව කම්කරුවන්ගේ, තරුණයන්ගේ හා ගම්බද දුගීන්ගේ දැවැන්ත මහජන නැගිටීමකින් ශ්‍රී ලංකාව සොලවනු ලැබුවා. අප්‍රේල් මාසයේ මුල සිට පැය ගණන් දෛනික විදුලි කප්පාදුව සමග ආහාර, ඉන්ධන සහ ඖෂධ වැනි අත්‍යවශ්‍ය ද්‍රව්‍යවල හිගය සහ ඒවායේ අහස උසට නැගෙන මිල ගණන් ඇතුළු දරාගත නොහැකි කොන්දේසි විසින් කම්කරුවන් අරගල වලට තල්ලු කර තිබෙනවා. ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ සමාජ අර්බුදය වසංගතයෙන් හා ඉන්පසු යුක්‍රේනයේ යුද්ධය මගින් දැවැන්ත ලෙස උත්සන්න කෙරුණා. කම්කරු පන්තිය මේ වසරේ මහජන නැගිටීමේදී අප්‍රේල් 28 වෙනිදා, මැයි 6 වෙනිදා පැවති මහා වැඩවර්ජනවලට මිලියන ගණනින් සහභාගී වෙමින් තීරණාත්මක භූමිකාවක් ඉටු කළා. පාලක පන්තියේ සියලු කණ්ඩායම් මගින් ප්‍රවර්ධනය කරන වාර්ගික රේඛා කපාගෙන සිංහල, දෙමළ හා මුස්ලිම් කම්කරු පන්තිය එක්සත් වූ මෙම බලගතු මහජන ව්‍යාපාරය මගින් ජූලි මාසයේ මැදදී රටෙන් පලා යාමටත් පසුව ධූරයෙන් ඉල්ලා අස්වීමටත් රාජපක්ෂට බල කෙරුණා. ධනේශ්වර දේශපාලන සංස්ථාපිතයේ සියලුම පක්ෂවලට එරෙහිව විප්ලවවාදී සමාජවාදී වැඩපිළිවෙලක සහ ඉදිරි දර්ශනයක පදනම මත කම්කරු පන්තිය ස්වාධීනව බලමුළු ගැන්වීමට සටන් කරමින් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ සමාජවාදී සමානතා පක්ෂය සහ සමාජ සමානතාවය සඳහා ජාත්‍යන්තර තරුණයෝ සහ ශිෂ්‍යයෝ සංවිධානයේ අපි මෙම මහජන නැගිටීමට බලගතු ලෙස මැදිහත් වීමක් සිදු කළා. සමග ජන බලවේගය දෙමළ ජාතික සන්ධානය සහ ජනතා විමුක්ති පෙරමුණ වැනි ඊනියා විරුද්ධ පක්ෂ ඒ වගේම ඔවුන්ගේ ව්‍යාජ වාම හෙංචයියන් වන පෙරටුගාමී සමාජවාදී පක්ෂය සහ වෘත්තීය සමිති ඒජන්තයින් මම ඉහත නම් කළ සංවිධානවලට ඇතුළත් වෙනවා. මහජන නැගිටීම හේතුවෙන් රාජපක්ෂට බලයෙන් ඉවත්වීමට සිදුවවද මහජන විරෝධතාවලට තොඩුදුන් දැවෙන ප්‍රශ්න කිසිවක් විසඳිලා නැහැ. පුළුල් ලෙස අපකීර්තියට පත් වූ පාර්ලිමේන්තුවක් විසින් පත් කරන ලද ජනාධිපති රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහගේ නව ආණ්ඩුව ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන් ජාත්‍යන්තර මූල්‍ය අරමුදල විසින් නියම කරන ලද කප්පාදු පියවරයන් ක්‍රියාවට නැගීම මගින් වැඩ කරන ජනතාවගේ සහ ග්‍රාමීය ජනතාවගේ සමාජ හා ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී අයිතීන් මත දැවැන්ත ප්‍රහාරයක් මුදා හරිමින් තිබෙනවා. ඉන්දියන් සාගරයේ මහා බල ගැටුමට සම්බන්ධ නොවීම පිළිබඳ වික්‍රමසිංහ ආණ්ඩුවේ ප්‍රකාශ නොතකා විවෘත සහ විශ්වාසනීය එක්සත් ජනපද ගැත්තෙකු ලෙස ඔහුගේ දිගුකාලීන වාර්තාව සහ වොෂින්ටනයේ සහ නවදිල්ලියේ වැඩිවන පීඩනය සැලකිල්ලට ගත්තහම වික්‍රමසිංහ චීනයට එරෙහි එක්සත් ජනපද යුද ධාවනය සමග පෙළ ගැසෙනු ඇත. ඒ අයුරින්ම දකුණු ආසියාව පුරා සිටින පාලක පන්තියෙන් වැඩ කරන ජනතාව සහ ගම්බද දුගීන් මත ආර්ථික අර්බුදයේ බර පැටවීම සඳහා දැඩි කප්පාදු පියවරයන් ක්‍රියාවට දමනමින් සිටිනවා. න්‍යෂ්ටික යුද්ධයටත් සහ ලෝපුරා ආණ්ඩු විසින් ක්‍රියාවට දමන මෙම කප්පාදු වැඩපිළිවෙලටත් එරෙහිව කම්කරුපන්තිය විසින් නායකත්වය දෙන ජාත්‍යන්තර සමාජවාදී ක්‍රියාමාර්ගය මත පදනම් වූ ගෝලීය ව්‍යාපාරයක් ගොඩනැගීම සඳහා සමාජවාදී සමානතා පක්ෂය සමාජ සමානතාවය සඳහා ජාත්‍යන්තර තරුණයෝ සහ ශිෂ්‍යයෝ ව්‍යාපාරයට ඒකාබද්ධ වෙන්නේ කියලා අපි ඉන්දියාවේ ලංකාවේ සහ සමස්ත දකුණු ආසියාවේ කම්කරුවන්ගෙන් තරුණයන්ගෙන් ඉල්ලා සිටිනවා. ස්තුතියි.
My name is Evrim Yazgan. I am the national convener of the IYSC in Australia. As militarism shrouds the globe, the Asia Pacific is becoming a cauldron of war planning. In 1957, popular fiction writer Neville Shute wrote On the Beach. The 1959 film adaptation of the book was set here in Melbourne. The book tells of a catastrophic nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere. Human civilization has been wiped out everywhere except in Australia. However, in a matter of months, the nuclear fallout will mean radiation will kill the last remaining survivors here as well. On the Beach had a huge impact. It made clear that no one would escape the consequences of a nuclear war. This is even more true today. In the coming war, Australia is not some distant and uninvolved party. Australia and New Zealand have, behind the backs of their populations, been placed on the front lines of US-led war plans. The US and its allies are already engaged in an imperialist war against Russia. The conflict in Ukraine, however, is a prelude to a far broader and deadlier confrontation with China, which American imperialism views as the main threat to its global hegemony. US war plans against China were qualitatively deepened with the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, and then further accelerated under Trump. Under Biden, tensions with China are reaching fever pitch. Despite the threat to humanity, Washington is pressing ahead with its plans to reduce nuclear-armed Russia and China to semi-colonies. If this threatens nuclear war, then so be it. Increasingly, militarism and war dominate the politics of this entire region. Imperialist pacts such as the Quad, AUKUS and the Five Eyes have been set up to surround China in a web of US-dominated economic, intelligence and military force. Any governments or political leaders that are seen to stand in US imperialism's way or even enter discussions with China are threatened, intimidated and removed from office. Australia's central role in the US-led war drive against China has been prepared under successive governments, Liberal National Coalition and Labor alike. Australian imperialism is not blindly following the US war plans. It is functioning as the most aggressive attack dog in the confrontation with China. This is motivated in part by Australia's own predatory interests in the South Pacific, which it has oppressed and exploited for more than 100 years. In 2011, Obama announced the pivot to Asia from the floor of Australian Parliament, underscoring the centrality of Australia to the US war plans. The Greens-backed Labor government of Julia Gillard signed a military agreement providing for the ever greater integration of Australia's armed forces into the US war machine. This has been deepened by every government over the past decade and is now accelerating under the Labor government of Anthony Albanese. His first act as Prime Minister was to jet off to Japan for May's Quad Summit, and his government has revealed plans to station US nuclear-capable B-52 bombers in Australia. Australia is set to acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, as well as hypersonic missiles, and other offensive weaponry that would play a key role in a war in the Indo-Pacific. As in other countries, the Australian and New Zealand governments will spend hundreds of billions on the military, while claiming that there is no money for education, healthcare, and other essential social services. In fact, war abroad goes hand in hand with a war against the working class at home. This has been made abundantly clear by the COVID-19 pandemic. Once hailed as success stories for mitigating the spread of the virus in 2020 and 2021, the governments of Australia and New Zealand fully embraced the murderous let-it-rip policies at the end of last year. This profit-driven campaign has led to a monumental health crisis. Nearly 90% of Australia's over 16,000 deaths from COVID have occurred since the beginning of this year. In New Zealand, nearly 98% of deaths from the virus have occurred in 2022. Thousands more are suffering the severe and disabling effects of long COVID. There is massive opposition among youth and workers to this program of war, austerity, and misery. The Australian ruling elite is attempting to suppress this opposition through an assault on democratic rights. This finds sharp expression in the efforts to silence the IYSSC on the university campuses. At two separate universities in two different states, student unions, working hand in glove with the pro-corporate university managements, have seized upon technical issues to disaffiliate IYSSC clubs. This is no accident. The universities are being transformed into centres of militarism and war. Every major university in Australia has established ties with the military and arms manufacturers to help prepare war, and many of them host pro-war think tanks that exist solely to promote imperialist propaganda. At the same time, Australia has been at the forefront of a McCarthyite campaign against supposed Chinese interference. No evidence of this has ever been provided, but governments and the media have launched filthy attacks on Chinese international students, Australians of Chinese descent, and those who question the plans for war. The IYSSC stands unequivocally against this reactionary campaign and the war aims that it serves to legitimize. We say very clearly, Chinese workers and young people are not our enemies. They are among our most important allies in the fight to prevent a nuclear catastrophe. The IYSSC appeals to students and youth in Australia, China, and throughout the Asia-Pacific region to contact us and take up the fight for international socialism against militarism and war. Together, we must build an international anti-war movement based in the working class and fighting for the abolition of capitalism. That is the only way to prevent the disaster that this system has in store and to guarantee a future for humanity.
2020
The escalation of the US-NATO war against Russia raises before young people the need to fight for the most basic right, the right to a future. Not only nuclear war, but the reality of climate change, an ongoing pandemic, the catastrophic conditions of inequality and poverty, the growth of fascism and dictatorship, all make clear that if young people are to have a future, we must fight for it. The youth of today have not lived a day in their lives when the United States has not been at war, and the consequences have been devastating. In the period between 2010 and 2019, almost 100,000 children were killed or maimed in military conflicts that have destroyed entire societies. Nearly 33,000 children have been killed and injured in the 20-year war in Afghanistan alone. That's an average of 1 child every 5 hours. The impact of war on young people in the US is far-reaching. Thousands of young US military recruits join purely out of economic distress. That is, they see the military as the only way out of their poverty, as the only option for affording an education. Many of those who have not died or been injured are forever scarred from their experience. In 2019, 5,861 veterans killed themselves in the United States. Youth have seen their friends and family members sent off to kill or be killed to advance the aims of the American ruling class for world conquest. The war abroad has also meant a war at home. The American government never tires of claiming that its wars are being waged for human rights. In justifying the war in Ukraine, Biden has spoken about a battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression. But what is the reality of social life in America? They talk of the American dream, but workers, and particularly young people in the US, confront the American nightmare. The diversion of unlimited resources to the American war machine is accompanied by the slashing of every social program that benefits the masses of people. Funding for public education has been cut to the bone, and students are graduating from college with immense levels of debt. More than 26,000 American workers die prematurely every year due to lack of health care. The youth of today have come of age during the COVID-19 pandemic, the worst global health crisis in over a century. They watched and suffered as over 21 million people worldwide, including more than 1 million in the United States, died from the criminal policies of the ruling classes of nearly every country. Millions of youth are now suffering from long COVID, which can damage the brain, heart, lungs, and other vital organs. More than 200,000 American children lost a parent or primary caregiver to COVID-19. Such a staggering loss will have a devastating and lifelong impact. Over 30 years of militarist violence abroad has penetrated into every aspect of society. It can be seen in the epidemic of school shootings, 46 this year alone, which is a product of the extreme social distress and the consequences of a culture of violence that permeates American society. Videos of police maiming and murdering workers and young people in the streets are a regular occurrence. Any youth in America can recall the violent scenes of the police murdering George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Jayland Walker, and countless other victims. The US has built up the world's largest network of prisons and jails, with over 2 million people now confined in horrifying conditions across the country. The US has the highest drug overdose rate of any wealthy country. Between 2015 and 2019 alone, children and young adults in the US lost approximately 1.2 million years of life due to unintentional drug overdoses. Youth should be a time filled with hope, optimism, and idealism. Young people have the right to a promising future. The reckless drive towards war must be understood as an attack on this right. War is the cancellation of all future. There is no shortage of opposition to the abhorrent conditions in America, particularly among young people. The question is, what is the political perspective that must animate the fight against war? It is not through futile attempts to the political parties and governments responsible for war that the slaughter will be stopped. In the US, the Democrats, no less than the Republicans, support the operations of American imperialism. Young people have already gone through the experience of Obama, the candidate of so-called hope and change, who became the drone bomber and deporter-in-chief. They've also had the experience of Bernie Sanders, who leveraged his call for a political revolution into a top position within the political establishment, where he himself has supported the US-NATO war against Russia. The youth want to fight, but they can't do so on their own. The turn must be to the working class and to the development of the class struggle. It is the working class whose exploitation is the source of all profit and which constitutes the vast majority of humanity that is the social base for a new movement against war. To develop a fight in the present to secure our future, we must be grounded in the lessons of the past. The ruling class dedicates enormous resources to cutting off youth from history, from the long tradition of revolution and working class struggles in the United States and throughout the world. No effort is spared on the part of the American ruling class to pollute the consciousness of young people with propaganda that argues against the basic truth of Marxism, that the history of mankind is the history of class struggle. An entirely false narrative, the 1619 Project, was developed to convince us that the history of the United States is one of ubiquitous racial conflict and division, the better to divide us against each other and to block unified movement of all workers. The history of socialist politics in the 20th and 21st century is the history of the Trotskyist movement, the continuation of the internationalist principles expressed in the 1917 Russian Revolution, in the fight against Stalinism, nationalism, and all forms of anti-Marxism that sought to deny the revolutionary role of the working class. The IYSSE upholds this legacy and fights to educate young people on the foundations of Marxism and Trotskyism. As Trotsky explained in the founding document of the Fourth International, the historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of revolutionary leadership. This, the building of a revolutionary leadership, is the great task that confronts us today. There are many challenges and obstacles that confront young people today, but the IYSSE is animated by optimism, an optimism that is based on an understanding of the revolutionary potential of the working class and on the lessons and experiences of history. I call on all of you listening to this meeting today, in the weeks and months ahead, to make the decision to join the IYSSE. Join the fight for a future. Join the fight for socialism.
Meu nome é Eduardo Paraty. Sou membro da Juventude e Estudantes Internacionais pela Igualdade Social no Brasil. A América Latina, como o resto do planeta, não será poupada em uma terceira guerra mundial. Enquanto levam adiante sua guerra por procuração na Ucrânia contra a Rússia, os Estados Unidos também estão preparando uma guerra contra a China, que veem como um rival econômico intolerável. Os países latino-americanos, com ligações econômicas e políticas profundas a ambas as partes, serão arrastados necessariamente para o centro do conflito. O início da guerra já impacta a classe trabalhadora e a juventude em toda a região, com uma explosão do empobrecimento. Um relatório recente da CEPAL projetou que 2022 terminará com 1/3 da população latino-americana vivendo na pobreza e mais de 13% em condições de pobreza extrema. Até hoje, os trabalhadores não recuperaram suas condições econômicas anteriores à pandemia, apesar dos mais ricos terem aumentado fortemente a sua renda. Desde o início da massiva crise desencadeada pela pandemia do coronavírus, aqueles que não foram lançados ao desemprego foram obrigados a trabalhar em ambientes inseguros sob o risco de se contagiar e transmitir a Covid-19. Essa situação continua até hoje. Segundo o The Economist, a América Latina acumula 2,6 milhões de mortes em excesso desde o início da pandemia, ou 1/10 das mortes por Covid em todo o mundo. A situação social enfrentada hoje é resultado dos crimes históricos do imperialismo americano e da burguesia latino-americana. O século XX na América Latina foi marcado por sucessivos golpes e regimes fascistas apoiados pela CIA em nome de Wall Street. A classe dominante latina está respondendo às enormes pressões do imperialismo, buscando um impossível equilíbrio de suas relações externas. O simbólico aperto de mão entre o presidente venezuelano Nicolás Maduro, herdeiro político do chavismo, e o secretário de Estado dos Estados Unidos, John Kerry, que busca apoio à ofensiva imperialista na Ucrânia, ilustra a crise da burguesia latino-americana. Não apenas Maduro, mas os vários representantes da Maré Rosa, que retornaram ao poder nos últimos anos, são implacáveis defensores do capitalismo. Gabriel Boric no Chile, Pedro Castillo no Peru e Gustavo Petro na Colômbia, todos vêm respondendo ao aumento das greves e protestos dos trabalhadores e jovens com violenta repressão policial e militar. No Brasil, centenas de milhares de trabalhadores, e especialmente jovens, tomaram as ruas em 2021 contra a assassina política de imunidade de rebanho do governo fascistoide de Jair Bolsonaro. O Partido dos Trabalhadores e os partidos da pseudo-esquerda, com seus sindicatos e organizações estudantis, desviaram essa luta de um confronto necessário com o sistema político capitalista. Ao invés disso, eles orientaram toda a oposição para a eleição de um novo e terceiro governo do ex-sindicalista Lula da Silva, do PT. O principal objetivo do novo governo do PT é encobrir a crise mortal do capitalismo brasileiro e reabilitar as forças políticas e militares ativamente envolvidas nas conspirações ditatoriais de Bolsonaro. Para lutar contra a miséria capitalista, a ameaça do fascismo e para garantir um futuro, a juventude precisa assumir uma perspectiva socialista e internacionalista. Ela precisa romper decisivamente com o PT e os demais partidos da Maré Rosa, defensores das burguesias nacionais, e se voltar para a classe trabalhadora internacional. Especialmente na América Latina, a nova geração que entra em luta é confrontada por uma série de organizações pseudo-esquerdistas, herdeiras do pablismo e suas variantes, como o morenismo. Essas são tendências políticas que posam como revolucionárias e até mesmo trotskistas, mas que há muito tempo repudiaram os princípios fundamentais da Quarta Internacional. O seu propósito é desorientar as aspirações socialistas da juventude e aprisioná-la nos limites da política nacional burguesa, nos sindicatos e na burocracia estudantil. Essas organizações pseudo-esquerdistas são hoje os defensores mais abertos da América Latina da guerra imperialista na Ucrânia e dos interesses da OTAN. A linha política principal dos morenistas da LIT, da UIT e da LIS é pressionar as potências imperialistas para que enviem mais armas à Ucrânia e levem a guerra contra a Rússia, entre aspas, até o fim. Nas universidades e sindicatos brasileiros, tais partidos fizeram campanhas de arrecadação para a chamada resistência ucraniana e propagandearam que a existência de forças fascistas em suas fileiras era uma mentira. O PSTU, seção brasileira da LIT, à frente do Sindicato dos Metalúrgicos de São José dos Campos, está numa campanha para condicionar a luta dos trabalhadores da Avibras por seus empregos à demanda de investimentos massivos na indústria de defesa brasileira. Eles estão preparados para conduzir os trabalhadores brasileiros para a guerra. Esse deve ser um alerta vermelho para a juventude. As políticas pró-imperialistas reacionárias assumidas por essas organizações hoje são a consequência da trajetória política traidora do pablismo, organizado sob a bandeira do Secretariado Unificado. Desde 1953, o Comitê Internacional da Quarta Internacional levou adiante uma luta sistemática contra o revisionismo pablista. A luta pelo socialismo genuíno é impossível sem um estudo e assimilação dessa história. Na América Latina, o pablismo foi responsável por impedir que toda uma geração de jovens e trabalhadores radicalizados entendessem a perspectiva histórica e princípios do trotskismo e da Quarta Internacional. Os pablistas promoveram a Revolução Cubana e os métodos de Che Guevara como um guia atualizado para a Revolução Socialista, baseado no repúdio à concepção de Lenin de uma liderança revolucionária consciente e da centralidade da classe trabalhadora. Isso levou milhares de jovens à via catastrófica da guerrilha. Quando as ditaduras latino-americanas ruíam sob poderosas ondas grevistas da classe trabalhadora, as mesmas organizações desviaram os trabalhadores da luta revolucionária, defendendo apenas reformas democráticas do Estado burguês. A crise na América Latina hoje, com as economias nacionais destroçadas e a burguesia retornando a formas ditatoriais de governo, ressalta a falência dessas perspectivas políticas nacionalistas. A integração cada vez mais profunda da economia mundial exacerbou as contradições e a crise do capitalismo. Porém, ela também unifica e fortalece a classe trabalhadora internacional, mais interligada e numerosa do que em qualquer outro momento na história. Essa força social, se unificada tanto nos países imperialistas como oprimidos, é capaz de impedir uma catástrofe nuclear e reorganizar a economia mundial sob diretrizes socialistas. Essas mesmas forças sociais impulsionam o crescimento do movimento trotskista mundial, a Quarta Internacional, liderada pelo Comitê Internacional, como a direção revolucionária na América Latina e no mundo. A juventude deve se voltar à poderosa força da classe trabalhadora internacional e ao programa revolucionário do CIQI.
My name is Evan Blake. I'm the coordinator of the WSWS Global Workers Inquest into the COVID-19 pandemic. In early 2020, the World Socialist website identified the pandemic as a trigger event in world history. It would deepen the global crisis and contradictions of capitalism and accelerate the drive to imperialist war and socialist revolution. The war in Ukraine had long been planned by American imperialism, but the pandemic heightened geopolitical tensions and set the stage for the outbreak of the war. Over the past 3 years, the pandemic has exposed the capitalist ruling elite's staggering indifference to mass death. It is proven that the bourgeoisie today is no less ruthless and criminal than the bourgeoisie that plunged mankind into World Wars I and II. They have once again shown themselves to be willing to sacrifice tens of millions of lives in pursuit of profits. The pandemic amounts to another war that's been waged, a war of each ruling class against its population. While the capitalists have amassed trillions of dollars during the pandemic, for workers and young people throughout the world, the past 3 years have been catastrophic. According to The Economist, there have now been over 20 million excess deaths attributable to COVID-19. The first 2 years of the pandemic saw life expectancy decline globally for the first time since World War II. Over 10 million children throughout the world have experienced the death of a parent or primary caregiver to COVID. The level of trauma and suffering inflicted on these youths by the loss of their loved ones is unfathomable. Despite all the lies that COVID doesn't affect children, the reality is that tens of thousands have died globally, and it is now one of the leading causes of pediatric deaths. In addition, the immense toll of long COVID, which can impact nearly every organ in the body, is deepening each day. The pandemic has been aptly described as a mass disabling event. In the US alone, 20 million people are now suffering from long COVID, including 4 million who are so profoundly disabled that they can no longer work at all. Hundreds of millions more worldwide are suffering from this affliction. We are now entering the third winter of the pandemic in the Northern Hemisphere, and contrary to the lies of Joe Biden and other politicians, it is nowhere near over. Cases and hospitalizations are surging once again throughout the world. Today's rally is being held as cases are spiraling out of control in China just 1 month after the Chinese Communist Party began to lift their zero COVID policy on November 11th. For over 2 years, China suppressed viral transmission through mass testing, contact tracing, temporary lockdowns, mask mandates, and the use of other public health measures. Their per capita death rate is by far the lowest of any major country in the world, just 0.1% that of the United States, where over 1.1 million people have been killed by COVID. Throughout the pandemic, the imperialist powers and their pliant media have continuously propagandized against zero COVID in China. They have done so for 2 central reasons. First, they seek to fully restore capitalist production in China and reopen the country's borders to put an end to the supply chain crisis which has impinged on their profits. Second, the Western powers seek to provide political cover for their own criminal policies. The ending of zero COVID in China, which they know could kill millions of people, enables the US and European powers to claim that the needless deaths of millions in their countries were inevitable. Early in the pandemic, it was demonstrated by China, New Zealand, and other countries that the coronavirus could be eliminated. After lifting zero COVID, each country has met with disaster. The central lesson from this experience is that the pandemic could have been stopped and still can be stopped, but that it requires a globally coordinated strategy. In the long term, zero COVID in one country is impossible. Last month, humanity passed the threshold of 8 billion people alive in the world today. We live in a deeply interconnected global society, and the pandemic is just one problem we face under capitalism. On the social front, industrial development under capitalist private ownership leads to ever-deepening social inequality. On the geopolitical front, the capitalist division of the world into rival nation-states leads to the outbreak of war and imperialist plunder. In mankind's interaction with nature and extraction of resources necessary for our survival, capitalist development has given rise to climate change and the threat of pandemics, which are deeply interconnected. Climate change is among the greatest dangers confronting this generation. In this century alone, tens of millions of people have already been displaced due to the effects of global warming. If the status quo continues, in the coming decades, hundreds of millions more will be displaced as coastal areas throughout the world become uninhabitable. Tens of millions could die from flooding, wildfires, drought, storms, heat waves, and the collapse of critical ecosystems. A major study published in April found that climate change will dramatically increase the potential for viruses that already exist among animal populations to spill over to humans, as took place with COVID-19, HIV, Ebola, and other diseases. The experience of the past year, in which the ongoing dangers of COVID-19 have been covered up through relentless propaganda, shows that the next pandemic will be met with total indifference. As the climate crisis deepens each year, millions more young people are learning about these dangers and looking for a means to stop the growing catastrophe. 2019 saw the largest protests against climate change in history, with over 6 million people demonstrating at 4,500 locations in 150 countries. These powerful demonstrations were met with empty promises from the powers that be. The capitalists have done and will continue to do nothing to stop climate change. All appeals to them will fall on deaf ears. Throughout the pandemic, capitalist governments have proven themselves incapable of organizing a rational scientific response to the greatest public health crisis in a century. To believe that they will change course and address climate change or prepare for future pandemics would be delusional. Rather, young people must turn to the international working class, the great revolutionary force in capitalist society. None of the problems we face can be resolved without a global movement of the workers and youth against the capitalist system. The IYSSC is the only youth movement in the world which upholds science and draws the necessary political conclusions from the objective reality that we confront. Throughout the pandemic, we have called for a globally coordinated zero COVID strategy to deploy every public health measure necessary to stop viral transmission throughout the world. A global socialist public health program could eliminate not only COVID, but also numerous other diseases that kill millions each year. In response to climate change, there must be a thorough reworking of energy, transportation, and agricultural infrastructure internationally to sharply reduce greenhouse gases. To achieve this, we demand the internationalization of the major corporations and banks and the reallocation of the gargantuan military budgets to invest in education, research, and technology, and fund wind and solar energy, carbon capture, and more. We stand for internationalism against nationalism. In opposition to the imperialist war planning, we propose a war to end inequality, the threat of fascism, the pandemic, climate change, and poverty in every country. Join us in this fight, the fight for socialism.
In taking up the fight against war, young people are embarking on a task of immense urgency, but also of immense complexity. To successfully confront the challenges ahead requires the careful study of the lessons of history and revolutionary politics. Mering Books is the publishing arm of the International Committee of the Fourth International and the World Socialist website. It publishes and distributes the classics of Marxism, including the writings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, and others. It also publishes the writings of the leading members of the International Committee of the Fourth International, including the writings of David North, chair of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website. Among these books is A Quarter Century of War. This book is a critical examination of the past quarter century of unrelenting militarism and expansion by Washington that have created the global context of crisis and war that currently confronts us. It is impossible to address the problems ahead without understanding these challenges, and this book is an indispensable read for that purpose. The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century, a systematic examination of the problems of the 20th century and why these problems remain unresolved, confronting us today. The heritage we defend, the essential history of the Fourth International and World Trotskyism. Mering Books also publishes the writings of Vadim Ryovin, a Russian historian dedicated to rescuing the narrative of the struggle of the Fourth International and the left opposition, in opposition to all of the betrayals carried out by Stalinism, as it betrayed the Russian Revolution. Mering Books makes available writings on culture, art, politics, and philosophy. The fight for socialism is the fight to defend all of the great gains of human culture and science from the ravages of war and capitalist barbarism. This requires of us systematic and dedicated study. Take up that fight today.
I'm 95 years of age and was born in August 1927, 9 years after the end of the First World War. It was a war in which, as the IYSSE statement said, imperialism introduced the world to the horrors of trench warfare, poison gas, and the murderous technical innovations of aerial bombardments, submarines armed with torpedoes, and tanks. It was a war that killed 20 million people and injured 21 million more. For my parents' generation, this was supposed to be the war to end all wars. But my childhood had lived against a background of a slow build-up to a Second World War. I was 6 years old when the Nazis took power in Germany, and 9 when the combined fascist forces of Germany, Italy, and Spain, assisted by the treachery of the Stalinists, drowned Spain's working-class revolution in blood. When I was 12, the world was engulfed in an even more bloody conflict, described as total war. It was an industrialized slaughter on an unimaginable scale, which resulted in the deaths of more than 70 million people, 3.5% of the world's population. The crimes of German imperialism are immense. The war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, which was at the center of Hitler's racial war. The Holocaust, 6 million Jews systematically murdered in the extermination camps at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and elsewhere. But this was a war of universal barbarism. From 1942 to 1945, a campaign of indiscriminate terror bombing by the US and Britain destroyed most of the cities of Germany and killed 600,000 people, most of them women and children. The final act of utter criminality was the dropping of the atom bomb by the United States on Japan. On August 6, 1945, one atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima killed 80,000 people, Tens of thousands more would die of radiation exposure, and a second bomb, 2 days later, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing more than 40,000. The crimes of the imperialist powers, committed in 2 world wars, and in all the other conflicts of the last 100 years, in Korea, in Vietnam, the Falklands, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and elsewhere, have all been justified with hypocritical invocations of the defense of freedom and democracy. All a tissue of lies. Today, the world once again stands on the brink of an abyss. The US NATO proxy war against Russia in Ukraine is escalating towards a third world war, a catastrophe that would threaten the very existence of humanity. Such a war would begin where the Second World War ended, with the use of nuclear weapons. But the destructive capacity of these weapons has increased to an unimaginable degree. One nuclear bomb with a yield of 1 megaton could totally destroy an area of 80 square miles. And yet Biden's recent use of the threat of Armageddon against Putin makes clear that the plans for nuclear war are not only contemplated, but have already been made. This must be stopped. Only the international working class can stop this madness. The working class is the most powerful force on the planet. The development of technology, which has made world war ever more deadly, has also expanded and unified the working class on a world scale. I have spoken of a century of bloody wars, but I have lived my life within the mass socialist movement of the working class that sought an end to war and an end to capitalism. The horrors of world war led me to become a socialist. I was inspired by the October Revolution, historic event that ended World War I and opened up the possibility of a better world. But the fate of my generation and others in the 20th century was determined by the domination of Stalinism and social democracy, which held the allegiance of millions. They were instrumental in defending capitalism from the massive revolutionary struggles that erupted after both world wars at immense cost to humanity. The exposure of the crimes of Stalinism led me to become a member of the Trotskyist movement, dedicating my life to building a genuine socialist leadership for the world working class. From the vantage point of a life that has spanned nearly a century, 8 decades of which have been devoted to the decades-long struggle for socialism, I can say to young people attending this meeting that though the dangers we all face are immense, the conditions for overcoming them have never been more favourable. Today, Stalinism and social democracy have been discredited in the eyes of millions. Leon Trotsky's struggle against Stalinism to defend the perspective of world socialism has proved to be the only basis on which war can be overcome. These are the days when the perspective can win the allegiance of the working class far, far bigger than when I first became politically active, and objectively unified by global productive processes and extraordinary technological developments, including instantaneous communication, that show the vast potential to build a unified world. But this must be fought for. I appeal to the young people at this meeting. Your generation now holds the fate of humanity in its hands. Take up this challenge. Join and build the IYSSE. Stop the reckless drive towards nuclear war. Fight for a socialist future without poverty, exploitation, war, and all forms of oppression.
Today's online rally marks a milestone in the beginning of an international movement of the working class against the war in Ukraine. Today's speakers have not only explained the historical origins, present-day aims, and potential consequences of the war. They have also exposed the criminal character of this war and presented an indictment of all the governments responsible for its planning, instigation, and execution. The speakers have refuted the lies that form the substance of the propaganda with which governments and the media seek to numb public consciousness and manufacture support for the war. Taken as a whole, today's speeches lead to definite conclusions about the nature of the US-NATO war in Ukraine and what must be done to stop it. These conclusions may be summed up as follows. 1. The war in Ukraine is, in its socioeconomic and political essence, an imperialist war, instigated by the United States and the other major capitalist powers that are part of the NATO alliance. 2. NATO's aim, led by the United States, is to inflict a military defeat on Russia that will lead to the breakup of the Russian Federation, the division of that vast country and the distribution of its immense natural resources among the imperialist powers. 3. The elimination of Russia as a barrier to NATO's eastern military expansion into Eurasia will, the imperialists believe, result in the encirclement of China and force the latter country's submission to the dictates of imperialism, either as a result of war or, as in the case of the Chinese regime's abandonment of its zero-COVID policy, concessions in the face of relentless global capitalist economic pressure. 4. In the final analysis, the political aim of the war, like the two world wars of the 20th century, is a new redivision of the world among the imperialist powers. The logic of this process extends beyond even the conflict with Russia and China. The NATO alliance and the ancillary military pacts that include countries in Asia and the Asia-Pacific comprise not a band of brothers, but a den of imperialist thieves and cutthroats. The logic of imperialist rivalries will lead in the not-too-distant future to bitter conflicts among the temporary allies of today. The enmities of the past, as for example between the United States and Germany, will inevitably reemerge. 5. The outcome of this process, unless stopped by the working class, will be a global cataclysm on a scale that dwarfs the violence of the past. Since the outbreak of the war, the potential use of nuclear weapons has been normalized in political discourse. 6. Notwithstanding the central responsibility of the US-NATO alliance in the instigation of the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, was a reactionary and desperate action undertaken by the Putin regime, acting on behalf of the ruling capitalist oligarchy that came to power in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991. 7. The Putin regime's efforts to justify the war by invoking the reactionary heritage of Tsarism and neo-Stalinist national chauvinism represents a despicable historical regression. The provocations of NATO would not have been successful were it not for the fact that the Putin regime is the outcome of the total repudiation of the far-sighted democratic principles upon which the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was founded in 1922, 5 years after the October Revolution. The Bolshevik government, led by Lenin and Trotsky, founded the USSR as a voluntary union and was constitutionally committed to the democratic equality of all the national and ethnic groups. the deliberate encouragement of national chauvinism in Russia, which finds its openly fascistic counterpart in Ukraine, created the ideological prerequisites for the fratricidal conflict between the masses of both victimized countries. 8. When examined in its essential historical perspective, the US-NATO war in Ukraine proves again the necessity for ending capitalism and the nation-state system in which it is embedded. The war is, in fact, only one manifestation of the fatal incompatibility of capitalist private ownership of the means of production and the division of the world into hostile nation-states with the progressive development and even survival of mankind. 9. From all these antecedent points flow the final conclusions. The struggle against war proceeds through the forging of the unity of the international working class and the ending of capitalist rule through world socialist revolution. And finally, 10. For the achievement of this world historical task, it is necessary to develop within the working class a new revolutionary party. But this task need not be undertaken from scratch. The foundations of this revolutionary party already exist in the Fourth International, founded by Trotsky, led by the International Committee today, whose work is based on the immense historical experience spanning a century of the Trotskyist movement. Today's international rally has advanced the perspective and program of socialist revolution and working class power, but it has been directed primarily to the youth of the world. This does not contradict our program. Rather, it is a critical and indispensable element of the perspective of world socialism. The youth cannot change the world without and apart from the powerful and socially decisive action of the working class. But there has never been, nor can there ever be, a genuine revolutionary movement without the fighting energy, enthusiasm, and idealism of young people. The population of the world has just passed 8 billion. The vast majority of these billions are young people, most of whom are in their teens and 20s. What has capitalism to offer them but exploitation, poverty, disease, fascism, and war? Many speakers today have said that youth must fight for their future. This is true in the most literal sense, because war, pandemic, and climate change all signify the absolute negation of the right to a future. Without life, there is no future. But in order to deprive youth of their right to a future, the ruling class must first deprive them of their hope. That is, the capitalist elites, controlling governments and the media, do all that they can to convince youth that there is nothing that they can do to change the world, that the injustices that exist today will exist forever, that the causes of human misery are rooted in the very nature of human beings and their somehow mystical psyche, rather than in the economic interests and relations that really determine the course of society. The opponents of the Trotskyist movement and the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, especially among the parties and organizations of the affluent middle-class pseudo-left, will claim that the IYSSE conducts its work at too high a theoretical level. It is, they claim, better to confine oneself to merely radical-sounding phrases and slogans, without complex historical references. We reject such criticisms. which are motivated by cynicism and an unstated but reactionary political agenda, with contempt. If young people are to change the world, they must understand it. Nearly a century ago, in 1924, Leon Trotsky wrote in an essay titled "Young People Study Politics" the following: Young people live in society. They are born into definite conditions. They step forward into life's arena in particular historical circumstances. And the sooner these young people open their eyes to the world around them, the better and more profoundly they grasp the conditions in which they live, the easier their push through life will prove to be. These words resonate in the present situation. To shift the world from its present-day reactionary trajectory to the trajectory of socialism is an immense historical undertaking. Its achievement requires the serious study of politics, specifically politics that is based on the Marxist materialist conception of history, which makes possible a scientific study of the laws that govern the capitalist system and the class struggle. Fearing the revolutionary enlightenment of youth, the ruling class does all in its power to keep young people away from any contact with Marxism and Trotskyism. It promotes ignorance of history, hostility to science, contempt for objective truth, and countless forms of cultural backwardness. They know very well that the glorification of imperialist militarism is undermined by socially critical thought. The reduction of youth to cannon fodder for imperialist wars requires blind obedience based on the old militarist precept, yours is not to reason why, but to do and die. But the International Youth and Students for Social Equality is determined to provide young people with the political education that they require in the fight for their future and the future of working people throughout the world. In concluding this rally, we call on you to make the decision to join the IYSSE, build a mass movement to end the Ukraine war, and take forward the struggle for world socialist revolution.
Yeah, to workers in Russia, Ukraine, China, everywhere in the world, we have no reason to fight a war, and we should unite over these national boundaries and break them.
I don't want to pay the consequences of the war as we paid the consequences of the pandemic. We are going to build a united movement to fight against the war.
And we need to unite and let the youth know that we have their back and that we can change things, fight for a better future and for a safer future for everybody.
The working class must put an end to the capitalism before capitalism puts an end to the world. That's why young workers and young people want to join to IYSSE.
Join the IYSSE. Young people, workers, wherever you may be, all this culture, all this philosophy, everything that we have now isn't just going to be taken away in this pitiless war without a fight. Whether it's actually successful requires individuals like you watching, wherever you may be, to take up a struggle for it.
Join the IYSSE. Fight against war and for socialism.